Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Sid Meier's Ace Patrol and Ace Patrol Pacific Skies for PC and iOS. These are both turn-based strategy games by Firaxis that were first released for iOS in the same year, in fact, which was last year, 2013. The original game was released in May, and Pacific Skies was released in November, and they were, of course, later ported to PC as well. What you're seeing is the PC versions, of course, and they are complete versions of the game, whereas the iOS versions are actually incomplete and have microtransactions in them, so it's pretty standard fare for iOS, but the PC versions have their own problems, and I'll get to those in a moment. But you may be wondering, well, why are you reviewing both of these games in the same review? You never do that. Well, they're pretty much the exact same game. There's a few differences between them, but not very much. Certainly not enough to really do separate reviews of the two games. So it's one of those weird situations where the sequel was so incremental that there's almost no difference between the two games. It has a bit more content, but that's pretty much it. And, well, the setting, of course, is different. But the real question is, how are these two games? I mean, Sid Meier is known for developing really, really great strategy games. So how does his offerings on iOS translate these just fantastic 4X experiences, or do they do something else entirely? Well, before we really get into the meat of the game, let's first talk about the presentation, which is not at all impressive. Granted, of course, it's an iOS game, but even then, these do not inspire confidence in terms of their graphics or sound design. They are serviceable, and that's about it. The art style is certainly very bright and cartoony, and I do appreciate that, but it's not visually appealing. And in fact, the characters kind of weird me out a bit. I know that that's kind of a very subjective thing, but it's just something about these characters just puts me off. I don't know what it is entirely. I think it's just that they have kind of deformed faces and look very, very strange. And the rest of the thing looks mostly fine. It's just not particularly well detailed. I mean, the detail is certainly fine for what it is. It's not meant to be visually impressive, but even then, the visuals just wear on you after a while, and you're just kind of like, it's not that great. Then there's the sound design, which is goofy. The sound effects are pretty minimal. You've got your plain sounds, and that's kind of it, really. You've got some sounds that are atmospheric, but there's nothing that's really standing out to me as far as the actual sound effects go. The music is kind of cheesy, and I do not care for it. And it's, of course, done in that kind of gung-ho style that you would kind of expect for an upbeat, in this case, World War I and World War II experience. And then there's the voice acting, which is just really corny, sounds really amateurish, and it actually wears on you after a while. So they really just didn't hit very strong points with the presentation, and it makes a rather weak first impression as a result. But obviously what really matter are the story and the gameplay. Only there's practically no story in this game other than you control a series of ace pilots during, in the original game's case, World War I, and in the second game's case, World War II. And you basically just complete a bunch of pretty much randomly generated missions. And that's pretty much it. There's practically no story in this game at all. Your various pilots don't really have any character about them at all. They all say pretty much the exact same things. It's pretty wimpy, actually. And so it falls back on the gameplay. So what is the gameplay like? Well, it's interesting. You control your various pilots in the actual missions and give them various maneuvers during the actual mission to get them to move around. It is a turn-based strategy game, although you might as well call it more of a turn-based tactics game the way it actually plays out, because you are only controlling a couple of planes. But that said, you have all of these various maneuvers, and as you complete missions, your pilots will earn experience, which will, of course, make them level up, and eventually they will gain access to new maneuvers, more advanced maneuvers, that sort of thing. And over time, you'll also be able to upgrade their planes and get better planes altogether, and that sort of thing. And so it has its progression system. But the gameplay mostly consists of moving around the map with all these various maneuvers in order to usually just take out the enemy planes. And that's pretty much it, really. There's not really much to these games. You do have various objectives during the various missions, usually things like get to a certain point in the map, or destroy certain targets, or things like that. But the objectives become very samey very, very quickly, and you find yourself not really caring all that much in the long run. At least I certainly didn't. The actual gameplay is very simplistic, and I found that it really didn't boil much down to strategy per se. It was more boiling down to common sense. Let me tell you, dogfighting in turn-based is just not particularly fun. This is one of those things where it really did need to be more of a real-time thing, where you actually have to go and react to things and things like that, because as it stands, it just feels sluggish and boring and nonsensical. I mean, you'll have planes just outright stopping in the middle of the air in order to get input for their next maneuver, and it just looks ridiculous. But if you can set that aside, then obviously you're like, okay, well, it's a turn-based strategy game. Well, it must be fairly deep in terms of strategy. I mean, it's Sid Meier, right? It's extremely simplistic. I found myself doing pretty much the exact same things every single level. It got very, very tedious very, very quickly. And this was across both games, no matter what I was using, no matter what planes my characters had, no matter how advanced they were. It was just tedious and boring. Maybe it's one of those things where it's a good time waster if you're on iOS, but on PC, it's just not entertaining. And plus, it's pretty wimpy in terms of PC porting. They really have almost no options available. Pretty much everything is controlled by the mouse. In fact, everything is controlled by the mouse. So you can't rebind keys properly or anything like that. There's no graphics options available. I mean, it'll run on pretty much anything, probably even including a toaster. But it's just one of those games where it didn't really survive the journey from iOS to PC all that well. It reeks of a casual audience, and as a result, I can't recommend it. It doesn't have enough depth to keep people who are interested in Sid Meier games here. And as far as being a decent turn-based strategy game, it really isn't. There's not much to this game at all. I keep saying this game. It's two games I'm reviewing here, but they really are pretty much the exact same game. The only difference being that one is set in World War II, the other one's set in World War I, really. And one of them, which is the sequel, has a bit more content. But that's about it. There's really not much to these games. I really can't recommend them. They just bored the living hell out of me during the entire time I was actually trying to play these things. So ultimately, I give them 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.